Hi, I'm Dr. John Grazel, the Baha'i Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland, and this is the synopsis presentations I am making for the course that I give on peace building, conflict reconstruction, and international development. These synopsis presentations are not meant to be complete and self-contained, but they are memory devices for the students in connection with the actual course. One of the problems we face, however, is we live in a society that at this moment so worships competition that we actually suppress this idea of cooperation. And the example I give in class is just to ask how many people have read Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. And most students have had some contact with this book, which is often cited as the justification for laissez-faire economics and the free market system. And then I asked people how many have ever read a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And very few have ever even heard of it. And of course, this was Adam Smith's other work. It actually was his first and his last work. And in it, he actually explains that the free market is a mechanism, but what makes us human and what makes societies bearable and what makes civilization truly worthwhile is actually the moral sentiments between people. And what he said was the most important of all moral sentiments was the sentiment that people had where we feel happiness just when we see another person happy. If I see you suddenly become happy, I get a smile on my face. And he attributed this moral sentiment as being one of the most important to help us become moral and civilized human beings, and to actually help us deal with the vagaries of what would the somewhat automatic system of the free market. But we don't discuss that very much today. What now? Is that a philosophy? Is that an opinion? Is that an ideology? The other person I wanted to do today was to show that this actually is part of our biology, a part of who we are. Now, to prove both these points, or not to prove them, but to support both these points, the importance of international development, the way it has changed, and the fact that moral sentiment and the sentiment of cooperation is important, I show in the class, and people can see this on YouTube if they want, two presentations on YouTube, both of which I feel are absolutely extraordinary and I recommend to anyone. One is by somebody named Hans Rosling, who is a Swedish physician who worked for many years in international health, and the second is by a neurobiologist, V.S. Ramachandra. In the first one, Hans Rosling makes an absolutely masterful presentation of data that basically shows that over the last 60 years, the world has dramatically changed. And the divide that used to be seen between rich nations and poor nations, between developed nations and undeveloped nations, no longer explains what's happening in the world. If you look at that presentation, in a very unique fashion, he presents highly dynamic data that basically shows that the supposed poor and underdeveloped countries of the world have made enormous progress in many cases. So for a country such as Korea, very poor in the 60s, a major wealthy industrial power today. He also shows that when you break down regions into countries, you find out that you can't make generalities about regions anymore. That in the same region as there is a Korea, there is a China, and there is an Afghanistan. And therefore, you have to look at all the data now in very specific context. And what you really see is that the countries that are the furthest behind as countries tend to be those that are, for one reason or other, mired in conflict. The third thing he shows is that even within countries, you can no longer talk in terms of generalities. That within a country such as Brazil, you can have the poorest and richest people in the world. And in a country such as the United States, which is still high on the list, that difference between rich and poor has actually exacerbated significantly. So the world now is seeing a merging world where the disparities between nations and regions are rapidly disappearing, but the disparities between people are not disappearing, in the sense that there are countries, there are groups within countries that are more and more are separating in terms of where they are positioned on the scale of benefit. But there's no question that there have been major changes, and at a rate much faster than ever experienced before in history, in terms of improved child survival, improved income, improved education. And I commend to you to look at Hans Rosling's material. The second thing I commended to people to see is V.S. Ramachandra's presentation, where he points out that as human beings, we have discovered something very interesting. We have neurons in our mind that fire when we do something, when we pick up a fork, when we shake somebody's hands, when we feel a piece of cloth. But we also have neurons in our mind that he calls mirror neurons. And those fire not when we do something, but when we see another person. So I have neurons in my mind that fire when I pick up a fork, and I have neurons that fire when I see you pick up a fork. I have neurons that fire when I cry, and I have neurons that fire when you cry. And what Ramachandra points out is this is the basis of empathy, because this is the human mind actually reacting and feeling what is being experienced in another person. One mind experiencing and acting as though it belongs to another body. And he presents his own feelings about how this is really the basis of human culture, this ability for us to empathize with each other, because it is this ability that actually allows us to skip over what in the past were thousands and tens of thousands of years of biological evolution that occurred slowly, to cultural evolution, where I can see you do something, and through the firing of my mirror neurons, I can feel it, and I can then do it myself. I don't have to wait 100,000 years to become a furry animal in order to survive the cold. I can see you kill a bear, skin the bear, put on its skin as a covering and stay warm, and 5 minutes later I can do the same, because my brain has actually experienced what you have. So this capacity for empathy, and out of that for coordination, and out of that for cooperation, is fundamental to human society. And as we will see, I believe, we will see it is fundamental to explaining the tremendous transformation that occurred in international development after World War II, and incredibly important in understanding the successes, the failures, and the opportunities for the future. So pay attention to that very carefully, because it seeks to establish a scientific base for what others will then later see as highly qualitative information. But it is important, and I wanted you to really believe that what we are talking about is not just philosophy, but also physiology, and both material as well as spiritual issues, and quantitative as well as qualitative data that backs the assertions that international development has been a major, major factor over the last 50 years, and then the ability of people to feel, to understand, and to cooperate is a major factor in understanding its successes, its failures, and its potentials for the future.